Let's get started here. So thank you everyone for joining us today on what is our first webinar of a short series that we're going to be doing. Uh, some housekeeping items. So we are recording this as usual. So we'll be sending that out afterwards, and it's always available up on our Metric Insights YouTube channel after the event. Um, the lines are muted here as we have a largest audience, so please feel free to enter questions in the chat or Q&A window. Encourage discussion as we go through this. Um, and I think that's the main housekeeping items. We'll answer questions as we go or at the end. But let's jump into this. So I'd like to introduce Maris Moscovici again, our founder and CEO, who's going to be running the show today and taking you through the top 10 ways to fail at AI for BI. So Maris, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for joining us. Before we kind of dive in, I want to walk you through what the series is going to look like, because there are various blocks here and they all kind of fit together. So today, we're going to be discussing what are the major pitfalls. What can you stumble on as you're going to build an AI for BI solution? The top 10 most common ways in which failure can occur. And hopefully out of this, you'll have some ideas of things that you can evaluate internally for yourself and figure out, are there things that you're doing that maybe you should stop doing or you should do differently to ensure success in your initiative. Then in a few weeks, we'll be focusing on technology. So, one of the things that we are very lucky to have is the ability because we're a BI portal and we're connecting to all these different AI tools as part of our solution, we're able to really see the entire landscape. We integrate with essentially every single major AI for BI technology. And so we've learned a lot about, what are the various capabilities and limitations of each different types of technology set. And in this webinar, we're going to really talking about the landscape as a whole. What are the different types of tools that you can think about, and what are the pros and cons of various approaches. So, as part of that, we'll give you a checklist of criteria that you can apply so that if you're going out there and looking for technology, you can use this as a starting point in evaluating a technology to make sure that you haven't forgotten anything important in making that selection. Then with that behind us, in early March, we're going to be talking about what does the implementation look like for AI to BI, in the sense of what are the various stages included, what are the key tasks, how do you make sure that you've got the right people involved and the right tasks as part of your rollout strategy to ensure success. So it's kind of a, if you think of the flip side of ways to fail, these are the ways to succeed, and very tangibly talking about those in terms of how to organize a project. And then finally, at the end of March, we're going to be looking at the full picture. So kind of zooming out, pulling all the pieces together. We'll be looking at what are some tangible examples of the AI for BI solutions, and really taking the principles that we've talked about in these first three webinars, and saying, if you apply them, here are some examples of what you might be coming out with, and that will be kind of a way to make everything that we talked about in the abstract initially here, make it real. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in and start talking about what are the major pitfalls that you should be looking out for as you plan your AI for BI initiative. And before we kind of get into the details, I wanted to share with you a little quote from my favorite 20th century Taoist philosopher, Winnie the Pooh. He's a fount of much wisdom. For those of you that have kids and have been reading Winnie the Pooh books, know that this is the truth. And he said famously that always watch where you're going. He was talking about, I think, going out in the woods. He says, always watch where you're going. Otherwise, you may step on a piece of the forest that was left out by mistake. And I included this quote because the journey towards successful implementation of this new technology in BI landscape is, fraught with peril. There are many places you can misstep. There are many obstacles in the way you've got to get around. And so you want to be mindful of where you're going. And you also want to be, I think, tolerant of yourself and of others as mistakes are made, because everything that I'm going to talk about today is not really, not mistakes that people are making because they're dumb or because they're not thoughtful. It's just that, it's easy to make mistakes, and it's a new thing that everyone's is learning together how to do effectively. So with that, let's jump in. So one thing that you want to watch out for right from the beginning, right, is how you think about the requirements for your AI for BI bot, right? It's very easy if you're not very specific about the audience that you're trying to serve and the job that you're trying to do for that audience, that you can create a Frankenbot. The thing that you're seeing in this picture, right? So it's something that just tries to accomplish every task and essentially doesn't accomplish any task well, and doesn't really, looks terrible to everyone, right? So this is very common, and it's just because people will build without a clear picture of what they're trying to accomplish. And so how do you know if you're on your way to building a Frankenbot, something that's designed for everyone but is not going to help anyone? Well, you want to know the question is, can you answer these questions, right? If you can answer these questions with a very definitive answer, then you're good on that front. If you can't, then you should stop and deep dive further. So for example, which users is this system going to support? So your AI for BI initiative, the first rollout that you have, and not in a generic way. So you don't want an answer here. It's like, hey, I'm going to help sales people on within the whole sales organization ask questions about their sales data. That's a very vague question. You want to be able to pinpoint it to a specific persona that you're targeting with a solution, even to the point where saying, hey, Joe over there is an example of that persona. Because if you have that, then you know the market who you're serving, and you can validate your premises with that person specifically, rather than having some vague idea that maybe can't be validated at all. Then the second question, if you know who you're serving, then you want to understand, what are the questions that this audience is likely to ask? What are typical questions that they're going to likely ask of the bot? Well, we're going to be providing them value. So again, very specific examples. Not that you're going to limit to just those questions, but you want to have things that are representative of the things that you're going to be asking. And then what is the data that we need to answer those questions? Do we have that data at a high enough level of quality, at a high enough level of granularity and fidelity to do? Of course, that's very important, because again, otherwise building something that can't be done. And most importantly, like kind of pulling all these pieces together, you want to be able to understand, how are you creating value for this persona with the questions that they're asking? Are they asking things that they can't ask today, that there are just no dashboards or reports that answer them, and therefore this is kind of opening up white space that they couldn't possibly answer? Or is it a matter of the fact that they're asking something that they could answer today with dashboards, but it's very difficult for them to do so, right? In both cases, you're adding value. You just want to have a really good idea of how you're going to be creating that value, so that as you design and build your solution, everything aligns around that value. So again, if you can't answer these questions definitively, do not stop past go. Do not collect $200. Do not move any further. Take your time, step back, and make sure that you really understand the path that you're going to be going on before you begin the journey. All right. Next, it's very tempting to solve for very simple questions with the AI for BI solutions that you build, and completely ignore the harder questions, the why questions. Right? I can't count how many demos I've watched where I see something kind of completely trivial being answered. Oh, what are our sales this month or last quarter or whatever? Something that somebody could clearly answer on their own by just looking at an existing dashboard, right? And it completely ignores the fact that human beings, when they're dealing with these bots, your users, they're going to want to ask different kinds of questions. They're going to be asking follow-on, second order why questions. So, for example, right, maybe it's a trivial question, right? The beginning of the journey might be to realize that, hey, how's gross margin today? Well, it's down 10% from last year. There's probably a dashboard that could tell me that. In fact, maybe I've realized that by looking at the dashboard. What I want to ask the bot is the next order question. I want to say, well, what's driving this change? Why? Why is gross margin down 10% from last year? Well, gross margin's made up of cost as well as sales and revenue. It maybe turns out that the cost of goods has increased by 20%. So that's giving me a clue. Well, then I probably want to ask why about that? What's driving this? Why did this happen? Well, okay, tariff costs have increased by 40% on the wine cabinets in the US, and that's what's driving this cost. So that third question, that answer that you provide at the bottom, the capability to do that, there's clearly value, right? As a user, if I'm looking at that, there's no question that I'm getting something that I'm probably could not be look at one dashboard and find out. There's probably something that shows me my gross margin, but then I got to figure out what other dashboard shows the different compositions of that gross margin between cost and revenue. Then I've got to decompose that cost of goods into components, and then I got to look and see, well, what were those components last year? There's a whole bunch of analysis with traditional dashboards and reporting that your users likely to need to be able to answer that question. If you can answer it effectively with your AI for BI solution, you're adding value and you're creating a sticky, delightful solution for your users. Another very common thing that I see all the time is that they'll say, well, we want to build something. Let's build an MVP and let's not worry about security right now. Let's just build something that shows that we can answer the question, and we will go ahead and add security in phase 2, right? And we'll just release it to a very small group where we don't have to worry about security initially. This is the wrong approach because you're building on quicksand, right? You want to make sure from the get-go, from the start, that security is front and center because it is table stakes for any enterprise implementation of any kind. So that means a few things. It means you want to be thinking about single sign-on. How do you handle identity, right? Does your solution go in and can you come in and know who the user is and pass that user all the way through to where the SQL gets executed against the source database sources that you're working with, right? So that you're not divulging any information that the user should not be able to have access to, and that you're doing that with single sign-on, right? So you don't want to have, obviously, no user is going to want a bot that where they have to do a completely different identity management access than they do everywhere else. Secondly, through that identity, row-level security has to be enforced consistently the same way that they would if they're looking at that data on the dashboard. And again, you don't want to have to recreate the wheel here. You want to make sure that you're inheriting row-level security from the underlying system that you're working with. And that's again, table stakes. And then finally, and I think this is something that's not necessarily always obvious, is your bot has to be security aware in the way that it deals with the user. So what I mean by that is, if I ask a question, if I say something like, "Hey, what is our most highest revenue customer in the U.S.?" Right? I ask that question of the bot, and in fact, I only have access to the California customers, right? You can apply row-level security and say, what's the highest value customer in the US? And, the database says, well, applies row-level security. So it only looks at California customers and it gives me a value that says, oh, okay, this customer X is the highest value customer in the US and with this dollar amount. But that's the wrong answer, right? Because there was a lack of awareness when processing that question that in fact, I don't have access to all the customers in the US. So when I ask that question, I'm not going to get the answer to that. I'm going to get the answer to a different question. So you want to be mindful of this from the get-go. Make sure that the right scaffolding is in place around this. The right context is there for the bot so that it knows when a user is asking something that does not, where they may not have full access to everything. And the response comes back in a way that frames the answer so they understand what they're getting. Otherwise, they're going to get something that they're completely going to misinterpret and make the wrong decision in, and they're going to lose credibility in the solution that's provided. So when you go and hire, let's imagine you're going to go hire a new business analyst into your organization. The very first thing that analyst is going to do is not going to be to go and run a bunch of SQL. They're not even going to go necessarily and look at the data. The very first thing they're going to do is they're going to try to learn the business context for your organization. Right? And that's very important because without that context, if somebody asks them a question they want to be able to answer to help the user, they don't have the necessary knowledge to do so. They don't know exactly what the user is asking, so how can they possibly answer that question? Yet, when we build these AI for BI systems, oftentimes this business context is just not there, right? It's just going from a question into generating a SQL, and it's missing context. And that's a major place where you can stumble and fall and fail entirely. So, what do we mean by context, right? Context takes on multiple different forms. It includes organizational structures, knowing like how are these different groups organized, how do people refer to them, how do products roll up under the organizations, and what are the different ways in which those are organized. It can be abbreviations and acronyms, various ways in which people refer to things in shorthand within your organization. You want to think about all of the things that are sort of in the background assumptions that everyone in your organization understands and knows when they're talking about things that are going to be completely foreign to somebody coming in from the outside. And all those things need to be included as context for your bot before they can really answer questions if they're relevant to the types of questions that you're going to serve. So that's very important. Another thing, and this is a very common mistake that people make, is that people will just completely bypass thinking about a semantic model. So classic examples of this is that saying, okay, I've got a database, has a bunch of tables. I'm going to connect my bot to it. I've got some kind of text to SQL or something, and it's going to then, go, I'm going to ask questions and I'm going to hope to get results. And the semantic layer is really the foundation. It's the core underpinning of behind any kind of analytic solution, but especially any AI for BI solution. And without that, you're just building on quicksand, right? And sooner or later, whatever you create is going to look like this building. It's going to be collapsing right down into the ground because it's not built on solid ground. It's built on a sinkhole, right? And when you think about semantic layer, it's not just maybe the obvious things you think about, like, how do I join these tables? It's making sure you've got definitions for what's in each table. What are the columns in that table? And then what are the definitions of those? What are general ways in which various columns are used when joining and accessing information? So what are key column values? If I say I'm looking for a wine cabinet, and that's the name of a product, and that's found in the product column. Well, I need that semantic model information that will help me know that, okay, that's what I'm talking about, right? That is a product. So aggregation rules, maybe there's summary tables that should be used for aggregates and detailed tables that should be used for certain transactional information. Maybe there's rules about when various tables are applicable versus when they're not. There, in any large enterprise, there are thousands of these little minutia details around the semantic layer that are incredibly important. And you need to make sure that all the relevant details are available to your bot when it's going to be asking a question. In addition, you want to have all the KPI definitions and formulas readily available as well. So in the example I gave you earlier, if I say, what's my gross margin? If you don't know that gross margin is computed, in this way by combining, sales from this table and a cost of goods from this other table, then you have no hope of being able to answer the question by just looking at the tables. And the agent, a chatbot is just going to come up with its own idea of how to do it, which maybe sometimes will be right and maybe sometimes will be wrong. So it's going to have a very low quality level. So think through carefully what is all the semantic layer that you need as an analyst to be able to answer a question, and make sure that that same level of detail is available to your bot as context in your solution. Another very common, and I think this is really almost everyone maybe even starts here, is people start to think about, well, how do I get started? I've got all this existing AI, existing BI tools. I've got Tableau, I've got Power BI, I've got various tools in my ecosystem, and I may each of these things has an AI layer, right? I can turn on Copilot for Power BI. Maybe I can, go out there and turn this on for all my different BI tools. And then when people are in a dashboard, they're going to just go ahead and ask questions, and they'll just ask the question within context of being in that dashboard, and then we'll be able to answer questions for them. And that seems like at the face of it, seems like a reasonable thing to do, but in fact, it doesn't work at all, right? And there are a few reasons that are not necessarily obvious as to why this approach of just turn it on for all your dashboards and kind of call it a day as an initial MVP, it doesn't work, right? First of all, is that you generally have across all these different semantic models that underlie these dashboards, there's a high level of inconsistency in the quality of those semantic models. So sometimes you might have very good joins defined and very clearly defined measures and exception cases. Sometimes the models are not that great. So if you just turn them on you sometimes will get really poor results. But even if you have really good semantic models across all your dashboards, there are some other fundamental issues. And first and foremost among them is that the user of your dashboard has no idea where the semantic model begins and ends for your dashboard, right? They don't know that their dashboard only has data going down to a certain level of granularity. They don't know that adjacent information to sales, the marketing related stuff, isn't available in the semantic model. So if you just say, okay, here's your AI, they're going to ask a question, and oftentimes, as we looked at before, that question might span things that are not in that particular domain, that semantic model. So it needs to go somewhere else to ask it. And by definition, it can't, right? The AIs that are going to be set up for a particular dashboard are going to be limited to what the scope of that dashboard. So because of the fact that it's not obvious to the user what scope is available, they'll quickly exhaust that scope, and they're going to ask things that they can't get answers to, and it's going to be a frustrating experience for them that they're going to be unhappy with. And then the final question is, even if they have some awareness, if they're in that context of that dashboard, if they realize, okay, I can't get that answer, or the thing tells them, okay, I've asked a question, I can't answer that question. Well, what do they do next? They need to be able to ask the question of the domain that's covered by the other dashboard, and then somehow combine the information. You've got to have solutions that allow you to span more than what you're covering in a particular dashboard and do that coherently. Otherwise, you really are not building solutions that are going to be effective for your users. So along the same vein, a common thought that people have was like, well, if I'm going to build conversation analytics, this comes hand in hand with oftentimes if you don't have a very clear picture of where you're going, there's a temptation to create this sort of boil the ocean approach. Take a schema that has hundreds of tables in it, pull that in, and then ask questions against that entire schema and go, okay, I've got this one domain, one chatbot that covers everything. And in this context, when we mean by domain is you can think of it as a scope that's available to a particular bot that's talking to, right? And like a set of tables that are all joined together. And you're applying a statement across those tables to be able to answer your question. So a big mistake is to do that across a domain that spans the entire ocean. It spans on all your tables. And the reason for that's very simple. And that if you've got too many tables, you're going to have a problem where it's got multiple ways to do joins. Even with a good semantic model, it could get confused. So consistency is very hard to generate in those scenarios, right? Because there's always a big enough database. There are multiple ways to get the same answer, and you're gonna go astray if you in a LLM-based system where it's not guaranteed to do the same thing every time. So if you've got these really big domains, that's a problem. You want to make sure you've got domains that are clearly defined. So if you've got multiple domains and your bot is working across all those different domains, those tightly defined schemas that look at each area should be well scoped. So there's no ambiguity as to where do I go to run my SQL, right? Because I've got a domain for sales, a domain for marketing, or within each of those sales domains, maybe they're sub broken out. So the more you can go to a granular level, the higher level of consistency you'll have, the less likelihood of having problems. And the more you can avoid overlapping domains, right? So that you don't have kind of multiple domains that cover uh, overlapping areas. Now there's the possibility of asking questions of different agents and getting answers that are inconsistent depending upon which agent you're asking for. So there's some thoughtfulness here that you want to take on from the very beginning to craft what are your domains, where are the boundaries, have you covered them, have you defined them in a way that is coherent, and have you defined them in a way that does not create ambiguity for an agent when it tries to route things to the right answer. Now, when you are building dashboards today, if you've got a solution internally where you're just deploying, let's say, a report, a dashboard, you would never imagine shipping that without doing significant amount of UAT, or at least hopefully your analyst would never do that, right? Because it could be very much garbage data, there could be issues there, etc. But surprisingly, if you look at how people ship chatbots, there's not a lot of validation that happens on those today. And the framework for thinking about validation is very primitive. Something about the fact that the chatbot, you can ask it questions in many different ways, and it's not just one path, right? It's a conversation. Just lends itself to the false assumption that validation is just not as important. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Because you want to be thinking about how you're going to test, how you're going to pressure test each of your agents before they ever make it into the wild, right? You're not going to send your cargo ship as this picture out there with a crack in it. You're going to detect your crack in the shipyard. You're going to fix it, and then you're going to send the ship out whole, right? So the same thing applies for your chatbot. So or your agent. You want to be thinking about this validation framework across multiple different dimensions. You want to look at, do you have a comprehensive set of test cases? Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to ask every single conceivable question that your users will ask, but that shouldn't take you off the hook from coming up with a good representative set of questions. Things that really span all the types of questions that are likely, and put them there. And here you really, again, this comes back to the first item I mentioned, right? If you have a really good idea who your persona is, and you have a really good idea of the kinds of value you're going to generate for them, then by definition, you should be able to generate a really good set of test cases that's fairly comprehensive, that represents the types of things that they want to ask. And then you want to be able to create baselines for those and make sure that you're measuring against the baseline to know that you're getting accurate answers. So there's verification for accuracy is obviously a key step. But more so than that, you want to make sure that you've got evaluation for that agent or that bot for consistency, right? Because we've all seen that generative systems have a way of generating different answers on different iterations of the questions. And with AI for BI systems, that's a big problem, right? So you got to make sure that if you ask a question 10 times, you're getting the same answer 10 times. And doing so upfront architecturally in the system is critical. So that make sure that all these things are in place before your end users see the chatbot and start interacting with it. Another issue that you should just try to avoid is the temptation, right? Is to think about the fact that, well, if you're going to build an AI for BI solution, that you're going to just be able to replace dashboards and reports. I get this question all the time from people. Hey, aren't we just going to be able to replace dashboards and reports with these conversational analytics systems? And the answer is a resounding no. You're not in any time in the near future, right? Nobody knows the distant future, but in the near future, you are not going to be able to do this. These solutions that you're building are going to have to sit side by side with your existing analytics system. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward, right? If you think about it, kind of first principles perspective. First of all, in the near term, dashboards are easier for users to trust. Everyone's had experiences with hallucinations using LLMs. So a dashboard that is there, that has been created by the BI team, that has been verified, that is certified, those things, users are naturally going to trust this a system of truth. And if they're oftentimes, in fact, if they ask something of a chatbot and they see an answer, they may want to go and vet that against what they're seeing in a dashboard, or kind of sanity check it, etc. So removing those dashboards just removes this sort of safety net for them and this system of trust that's a really big problem. So you can't take it away. Second thing is, A well-designed visualization is just a very powerful communication tool. And there are many ways in which that visualization is more effective than a conversation. For example, if I want to see at a glance how all my key KPIs are performing, what I want is a well-designed dashboard or landing page which has all those KPIs. I can see them at a glance. I can see what changed in 20 seconds. I've got an answer. I don't want to go to a chatbot and say, "Hey, tell me how my KPIs are doing," and have it crank for like churn for 30 seconds or a minute or two, and then come back to me with the results. And maybe each time it's giving me a different set of KPIs. That is not the experience I want. I want a standardized, visualization-focused experience that is consistent and is absolutely not an AI conversation, right? So for that reason, and there's often the case, just in the examples that I've given at, there's a third bullet here, is that it's just much faster to get your answer with dashboards than it is for AI, right? So like in that example with the KPIs, if I'm just looking at trends, I want to really understand the trend of something. If I've got that on my, one click away to do that, it's faster for me to open that up than it is for me to ask the LLM to show me a trend, and then it has to go run the SQL, figure out what needs to run it, generate a chart, and so on. So because of speed, because of trust, because of the capability in terms of the capability of visualizations to effectively communicate, you've got to have your AI for BI solution sitting side by side with your dashboarding solution, and it's not going to replace it entirely. And that's the sort of the final item here. Ignoring your existing BI ecosystem. If you come to the realization that you're not going to be able to replace your dashboards and reports, then that means that you need to design something that is going to work hand in hand with your dashboarding and reporting and all the systems your users are currently using for analytics. That's going to complement that, right? And you want to think about that from the perspective of the user journey, right? So where are they starting when they ask their AI for BI question? When they want to ask something about the data, where are they? Can they get to it from where they are doing their dashboards? Do they need to have it someplace else? How are they going to transition between these different analyses? When are they going to want to go from a dashboard to an AI chat? When do they want to go from AI chat to look at a dashboard? Have you enabled those sort of interfaces in a way that it's a seamless transition? And then finally, that's also an integration point. How are they going to collaborate with your human analysts when it's necessary to do follow up? Right? Oftentimes, in that example, I found out that there's a gross margin is gone down. Well, I'm probably going to want to have a conversation with my analyst about that. And maybe there's some places where the AI only goes so far, and then the analyst has to take over. So how does that experience work with the chatbot you're building? How can they hand off the conversation and continue it and give it and then get the analyst involved in a way that context is preserved and that they are able to meaningfully have a dialogue there. So all these things, don't ignore your existing BI ecosystem. Think about your solution in a way that it can actually fit into your ecosystem if you want to have a successful adoption. So to close, we started with a little wisdom from Winnie the Pooh, and I want to end actually with wisdom from from someone else. There's if you guys know. There's Will Rogers. Will Rogers was the kind of famed cowboy philosopher in the 20th century. He was around obviously well before the AI or even computers or TVs were around. But he shared a little insight around how is it that people learn things, and he said there are kind of three ways in which people learn. Right? He said that there are three kinds of people. Actually, is the way he said it. Those that learn by reading. There's a few who learn by observation, and the rest who have to pee on the electric fence for themselves. Right? So my hope from this webinar and really from the series that we're going to be covering is that we're sharing some things here and that you kind of take away some things that you can apply in your environment and that you can make sure that learn from what others have done and where they failed and avoid sort of being somebody who is going to pee on the electric fence for yourself. So with that, I think we're actually at time. Mike, is there any time for
Yeah,
questions?
yeah, it's a couple of questions here. I think let's maybe take one or two, and then we'll be respectful of time. So you talked about one here. You talked about scoping narrow domains. Doesn't that severely limit the questions that can be asked? And won't a lot of questions span domains, especially the deeper why questions that you were talking about?
Yeah,
How do you address that?
yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's right. It's a sort of a architectural thing that you have to consider from front, in that you're going to have in a well-designed solution, you're going to have well-scoped domains and agents that operate within those well-scoped domains. But in addition to that, you're going to have a kind of overarching agent that can work with all of those domains. You can think of it as like all the tools that it can connect with and work with. And by the fact that you've scoped everything properly and you have good metadata in place around that, that overarching agent that the user asks a question of can then determine, when a user asks a question, what domain should they direct that question to, if in fact it's something that can be answered by that domain. Like, for example, oh, I'm just asking a question about sales. I can route that question to the sales domain. Or if it's something that requires, maybe it spans multiple domains. Maybe I asked a question like, let me think, like, what I'm looking at my list of what are my top 10 customers by revenue, and then I say, well, how much customer support volume are we generating for these customers? So now I've got to take those 10 customers that I've gotten from the sales domain, my revenue data information is present, and then financial domain, and then bring in data from the customer service domain, right? So the idea is that the agent ought to be able to ask questions on multiple domains and then consolidate and combine information together. But that each individual kind of small, finest grain bot that you're working with, that bot needs to be scoped very well so that it can generate high quality results within the lane that it knows the data about.
Maybe one more here. So you mentioned security awareness, the row-level security stuff, I guess that's referring to. How do you best deal with answering questions about data that you don't have access to?
Yeah. So assuming that you've gotten assuming that you've gotten the ability to do that authentication, right? So in this case, let's imagine you've got the OAuth and you've logged in, and now the bot knows who you are, and it knows that and then it knows and it's familiar with what is the scope of control that you have. So then the key is that when you get a question that's going to get answered, before the bot goes about and says, okay, let me go and do my SQL, generate my SQL for it, the very first question that's asked is, okay, what is the scope of domain for this user? And does this question appear to go beyond the scope of that of access for that user, right? If you're talking about row level security kind of capability. So the bot is role level security aware. It can bring in some of that information. It does a check to say, okay, I see that the user is asking for something that they don't have access to. And then the response, then, instead of going to generate a SQL at all, it will not generate a SQL. It will generate an answer that says you don't actually have access to the full country. This question appears to be a global question. We don't actually have access to this. And then it suggests the question that it can answer. So in the example I gave earlier, I asked, what customer do we have that has the highest revenue in the United States? The bot might say, you don't actually have access to customer information across the entire United States. You only have access to information in California. Do you want me to tell you who the highest revenue customer is in California? Right? That's one way to do it. Or another perfectly acceptable answer is the bot guidance is to say you don't have access to this information globally, but I can tell you that in your patch in California, the highest revenue customer is X. Right. So whichever way you decide to follow that, and that's of course guidance you guide the bot. The key is the awareness that the bot has up front around the limitations for security. Guide the fact that when it answers, it qualifies the answer with that key context.
Great. Well, I think we're at time here. Thanks everyone for joining. Encourage you to join us in a few weeks, as Marius said, where we're going to start delving into different tools and technologies of AI for BI and some of the pros and cons that we see in those areas. But thanks for your time today, and thanks, Marius, for the presentation.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. See you soon.